So how does a brand emerge in your brain? Up to this point, we've looked at what strong brands achieve and how consistent meaning shows up in the market. Now we shift to the deeper question. How does a brand actually emerge in the brain? Because if a brand lives in the mind, then understanding how the mind organizes information becomes essential. The brand constantly interprets the world. The brain constantly interprets the world by identifying objects, patterns of sights, sounds, and experiences that come together to form a single idea. A brand functions in the same way. It becomes an object built from many individual signals: what the product looks like, how it performs, what it costs, how it's talked about, and how it fits into someone's life. We now open the exploration of that process. It invites us to look beneath the surface and examine how separate impressions become connected, how associations take shape, and how meaning becomes stable in memory. Once you understand that mechanism, you can begin to influence it. And that's the foundation for managing a brand intentionally rather than leaving it to chance. The mind organizes the world by identifying objects, complete forms built from a constellation of parts. Before we talk about brands, it's important to understand this basic pattern of perception. The brain doesn't begin with meaning. It begins with the ability to recognize whole objects. Once something is perceived as an object, it becomes easier to store, recall, and use in future decisions. A brand functions the same way. Even though it's intangible, it is treated by the brain as an object, a unified idea that made up of many individual impressions. Visual cues, experiences, emotions, memories, and messages come together and form a single mental construct. That construct becomes the brand in someone's mind. Understanding brands as objects shifts the conversation. It explains why scattered signals never cohere, why inconsistent actions create confusion, and why intentional, repeated patterns build clarity. Once the mind assembles the parts into a single object, the brand becomes something people can recognize, describe, and choose. The mind understands the world by recognizing objects, wholes that are formed from a collection of parts. A mug is a simple example. Even though mugs can look different, the mind identifies them instantly because of features that define their mugness. They come together: an open top, a handle, a flat bottom, the ability to hold liquid. Each feature on its own doesn't mean much, but when they appear together, they form a single object. This is how the brain economizes attention. It absorbs individual elements, links them, and stores the combined representation as a complete idea. The parts fade into the background, and the whole becomes what we recognize. That's why different mugs can appear unique, yet feel essentially the same. The mind connects the elements into a coherent object without conscious effort. The same process applies to brands. Individual signals, product qualities, colors, price cues, experiences, language, emotions, all may seem separate, but the brain binds them into one mental object. That object becomes the brand. Understanding this process is the first step toward shaping the meaning people carry with them. Wholes being formed from parts. Take a minute to look at what you see here. What is it? Well, without context, it can be hard to see anything here except three dots on a background. So let's add some context and see if that helps. Here is some context. Now, what is this? Perhaps some more context will help. What about now? These three objects are part of the constellation Orion. They are in Orion's belt. Orion is a constellation that you see in the sky at night. in the northern and southern hemispheres. Here's another way of seeing the constellation Orion. What happens when you see a constellation? You take individual parts, individual stars and objects, and form a whole image. Once that happens, you cannot unsee that image. You will forever see the three stars as part of the belt, and the belt as part of Orion. When looking at the stars in Orion's belt, individual stars, points of light, mean very little on their own. But once they're connected into a constellation, the entire image becomes unmistakable. And from that moment, you can't unsee it. The mind automatically prefers the whole over the isolated parts. It does so because wholes are easier to store, recall, and use to make sense of the world. This tendency is exactly why constellations are such a powerful metaphor for brands. A constellation takes separate parts and turns them into a coherent image. The connections give those parts meaning. The same thing happens when people form a brand in their minds. They link experiences, messages, emotions, and impressions into a single recognizable whole object. Constellations feel natural because the brain is wired to create them. It joins fragments into patterns, patterns into objects, and objects into meaning. Brands follow this same logic. They are constellations of meaning, constellations in the mind. Brands follow the same logic and structures that help people understand who you are, what you offer, and why you matter. Seeing brands this way creates clarity. Instead of managing disconnected pieces, leaders manage the connections. And when the connections are intentional, the meaning becomes strong, memorable, and hard to unsee. The human mind is constantly forming constellations of meaning. It connects experiences, sensations, thoughts, and memories into coherent patterns that make the world easier to understand. Neuroscience shows that meaning is stored in networks of associations, clusters of linked ideas that light up together. Psychology reinforces this through Gestalt principles, demonstrating that the mind prefers wholes over fragmented parts. It organizes separate pieces into a unified structure and uses that structure to guide perception and behavior. Most of this happens unconsciously. About 95% of all thoughts occur beneath awareness, where connections form automatically and continuously. These connections shape how people interpret objects, ideas, and experiences, including brands. When a brand enters memory, it becomes part of this network, an integrated pattern of thoughts, feelings, and associations that influence what people notice, believe, and choose. The ideas from the previous section point to a central insight. The mind forms meaning through constellations. Objects, whether physical or conceptual, are built from networks of associations that link together in a whole. A mug or a memory, an idea or a brand. All rely on the same cognitive process. Characteristics come together, form a structure, and become something recognizable and meaningful. A brand operates in the same way. It becomes maybe intangible, but the brain treats it like an object. Impressions, experiences, and signals gather and connect into a unified mental construct. That construct becomes the brand people carry with them. Whether the associations are created intentionally or unintentionally, the mind organizes them into constellations of meaning. This understanding becomes the foundation for brand management and for creating a brand constellation. The goal is not just to create isolated messages or isolated experiences, but to shape the network that links them. When the associations support one another, the constellation becomes stronger, clearer, and more distinct in the market's mind. That clarity creates the conditions for recognition, trust, and choice. It is the starting point for managing the brand with purpose. Every organization creates a brand constellation, whether intentionally or not. Meaning forms in the mind automatically, and impressions people receive begin to link together into a whole. When those impressions are scattered, the constellation forms in a scattered way. When they are consistent and reinforcing, the constellation becomes clear, strong, and memorable. A brand constellation is simply the pattern of associations the market carries about a company. Those associations don't stay isolated. They connect and organize themselves into a unified picture of what the brand represents. The only question is whether that picture aligns with what the organization stands for. This is where the brand management becomes purposeful. The parts create a whole brand, and our job as managers and leaders is to shape the constellation, choosing the signals, the experiences, and the behaviors that guide how meaning forms. Brands will always take shape in the mind, but the strongest brands are built by managers who influence that formation deliberately. The Coca-Cola brand example illustrates this clearly. A century of consistent signals created one of the most powerful constellations in the world. The same principle applies to every organization. Will form. The opportunity is to shape it on that purpose. But what are we actually creating when we build a brand constellation? The concept of a brand constellation arose from research that I published with colleagues. We studied the relationship between financial brand performance and the meaning that people had in their minds. For well-known brands, by exploring how the number of one brand and the number two brands in a set of industries are thought about. We asked people to share the thoughts and feelings that came to mind when they thought of the brands, just as we did with asking you to think of Coca-Cola. And we had them rate whether each idea was positive or negative. From there, we used a tool called an affinity diagram, shown here, to understand the responses. We found that there are 8 categories of ideas that people think about when using brands. These categories form a useful model for understanding what people think about. As we found the individual categories come together to form a single object, the brand, we used the metaphor of a constellation in order to understand the concept. A brand becomes truly clear when its underlying structure is visible. The 8 dimensions of the Brand Constellations Framework provide that structure. They reflect the patterns of meaning people naturally form, and they offer leaders a way to shape those patterns intentionally. The first 4 are very familiar elements of the marketing mix: product, placement, pricing, and promotion. Each one influences how people experience the world. Product defines what the brand delivers. Placement determines accessibility. Pricing signals value and positioning, and promotion shapes the language and imagery that guide interpretation. These dimensions create the outward-facing expression of the brand, what people see, touch, and hear. The next 4 dimensions complete the constellation by adding context and meaning. Category establishes the space the brand competes in and expectations that come with it. Competitors shape perceptions through contrast and comparison. Company reflects the culture, values, and behaviors that bring the brand to life internally. And customers capture the thoughts, feelings, and actions that determine brand loyalty. Individually, these 8 elements are just points of light. Together, they form a constellation that defines the brand in the market's mind. When they align, the picture becomes coherent, recognizable, and compelling. This framework becomes a guide for shaping meaning intentionally, one dimension at a time, and ultimately as a unified whole.